Carlos de Luna, mistaken for a similar-looking murderer and executed in 1989. Ruben Cantu, convicted and executed for murder after another witness was pressured by authorities to falsely identify him as the killer. Joseph Odell, convicted for murder without the presence of blood or adequate DNA evidence. David Spence, executed for murder in 1997, based solely on testimony from bribed inmates without any physical evidence. Leo Jones, convicted for murder after being coerced to confess by police officers. Claude Jones, executed for murder in 2000. Further DNA testing has showed that he was not the perpetrator of the crime. This is just a small portion of real human beings who have been wrongfully convicted for murder. How many more of these cases exist behind the surface of justice? And why haven't murder investigations done anything to fix it? Is murder dead? Unveiling the untold secrets of murder investigations. But first, to understand what went so wrong, we need to look at the corrupt and complicated past of murder and murder investigations. Going back thousands of years, let's take a look at the very first recorded murder within human civilization and society. According to LiveScience.com, in 1989, ancient head bones with multiple unhealed head wounds dated back to 430,000 BC were uncovered by archaeologists. Further, the presence of multiple wounds suggests that this wasn't simply a fall or accident, leaving only one logical conclusion: murder. Earning its place as the very first cold case in recorded human history, it proves murder to be a natural phenomenon of human behavior that dates back to the beginning of time. Since the very first murder, murders became increasingly more complex and violent. And with that, restrictions, rules, and enforcement were put into place to try and both bring justice to murder victims and prevent these terrible crimes from being committed in the first place. In the past, specifically from the 1950s and 60s, the clearance rate, otherwise known as the rate at which murders are solved, in the United States was much higher than it is now. In fact, during the 60s, the clearance rate went up to almost 90%. While from an outsider's perspective, this may sound like a positive thing, the reality was far more alarming. Cases were frequently solved incorrectly, and tons of innocent people ended up incarcerated, causing the justice system to become increasingly corrupt and biased. But why exactly did this occur? And what was causing murder to go unsolved? This answer can be broken down into three simple reasons. 1. An obvious lack of technology. 2. Police mishandling and corruption. And 3. Socioeconomic and racial bias. Most prominently, a general lack of adequate and advanced technology greatly slowed murder investigations. Forensics before the 21st century very much still existed, but they were definitely not able to handle complex cases as they could today. According to UniversalClass.com, by the early 1800s, the recognition of fingerprint patterns was studied, but it wasn't until 1989 that America decided that DNA evidence was sound and valid, and the first American was convicted on the basis of DNA evidence solely. This lack of technology alone, in combination with underdeveloped technology, corruption, and police mishandling within the police system, have further exacerbated the rate of murders going unsolved. The most prominent of these examples is perhaps the Black Dahlia unsolved mystery.
In history.
You remember that murder case? There's new information.
The Black Dahlia murder refers to the brutal killing of Elizabeth Short, a young actress whose body was found severed in two halves in Los Angeles in 1947. Short's murder became a media sensation, and the investigation was marred by several issues. It was reported that some officers were involved in illegal activities, including bribery and covering up evidence, which compromised the integrity of the case. Inadequate preservation and documentation of evidence led to the murder being unsolved, without enough crucial information to build a solid case. Finally, during the course of history, especially in the United States, bias, or more specifically racial bias, ruled multiple aspects of American life. One way this was exemplified was through murder investigations, which oftentimes exuded racism, even in times when they were solved. The murder of Emmett Till in 1955 was a pivotal example. Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American boy, was brutally beaten and killed by two white men in Mississippi after being accused of flirting with a white woman. The initial response by local authorities was marked by indifference and a failure to thoroughly investigate the crime. The murder suspects, Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam, were known white supremacists, but law enforcement officers were hesitant to pursue charges against them due to racial bias. The decision reflected the deeply ingrained racial bias that permeated the legal system, where African Americans were oftentimes denied fair treatment. This pattern has continued throughout history and created the foundations of murder investigations today. After a complete analysis of various aspects of these issues from the past until now, we can conclude that murder investigations are currently ineffective. Yes, they have improved greatly from the past, but there's still a long way to go. So what do the numbers show?
The current clearance rate is 50%, an all-time low.
But numbers alone do not make up the full story. Let's take Japan for an example.
Japan, very often, if the Japanese think they cannot solve a crime, it won't be listed as a homicide. They have a category called unclaimed body, which is not a homicide. So that if you look at the statistics from Japan on their solving of their homicide rates, they're in the 90s. And if you look at the solve rates in the United States for our homicides, they're in the 60s. And I think part of this is that we have more inclusive, so we have more deaths that we're going to rule as homicides even if we can't solve them.
Because numbers are not a clear measure, in order to evaluate the extent of this change clearly, we must reconsider how the factors causing murders to go unsolved in the past play a role in the present.
Advancements in technology have helped us solve homicide cases faster and more effectively than ever before. An example of this is going to be forensics, and this technology is only getting better, and here are a couple of examples. We now use nanotechnology to analyze materials at a molecular level, helping us examine illegal drugs, explosive materials, or other biological elements. Today, we are able to detect and identify proteins called pretones, which can be found in bones, blood, or other biological matter to better analyze the victim's bodily fluids and blood. For example, if the victim came into contact with a poison-like substance, it could help match body fluid samples to an attacker. Pretones change over time, while DNA does not, so it can tell scientists valuable information about the environmental factors of the victim at the time of death.
So now let's take a look at some examples.
Four college students were stabbed to death in Idaho, and the police were able to crack the case in a matter of months, despite not having a motive, murder weapon, or any eyewitnesses, because of technological advancements. During the attack, they realized the murderer put his phone on airplane mode and had been at the murder site 12 times over the past 3 months. The police partnered up with AT&T to build their case and used video streams and TikTok to determine the location of the victims prior to the killing. They used door cam footage from around the neighborhood to track the suspect's car, giving the police enough evidence to make an arrest.
Still, in looking at this new evidence, we should also take into account the possible unintended consequences.
Like somebody who might be on a jury in a murder case might think, oh, if there's a fingerprint or blood evidence or something like that, then that seems more like objective and more scientific, and so we'll believe that. But there have been lots of instances of the police either making stuff up or just not being careful, and then there being people who are supposedly expert in these different forensic sciences like fingerprinting or blood spatter evidence or how gunpowder residue lands on a person's hands after they shoot a gun. But sometimes that's not any more reliable than like the identification procedure.
But what about the new aspect of social media?
Talking about with technology and stuff, like with cell phones and social media, we can really track a lot of people down and find out a lot of information. And actually plot where people are going or what they've done the day before, day after, just by phone use and stuff like that. So yeah, technology is definitely helping out.
One specific example of this phenomenon is when a woman was caught as a murderer using Facebook.
In March of 2015, two friends took a picture together, Cheyenne and Brittany. 18 hours later, Brittany's body was found on the side of the road, covered in welt marks that seemed to have been done from a belt. The police were able to match the marks on the victim's body to the belt Cheyenne was wearing because in the Facebook photo taken earlier, she was wearing the same belt.
However, there are also some downsides to this new growth in technology.
How we covered homicides in the past looks very different from today. Looking at previous homicide articles from earlier decades like the 1960s and 70s, we found that they were more factual, unemotional, and almost cold retellings of events. Additionally, there were early trends as to what actually gets newspaper coverage. For example, homicides by strangers are more likely to be covered than homicides where the perpetrator is somewhat known by the victim. Even though, in around 50% of all murders committed, the offender is someone well known as victim. This has drastically changed from today, with over-dramatized, inaccurate information of how and about crimes are done are in the news, or in some cases, the incident is completely hidden from the public.
Unlike newspapers of the past, recent social media has become extremely polarizing, and the new true crime genre has caused more harm than
I was born
good.
addicted to crack cocaine. I was only 10 years old when I committed my first
Killed
murder.
8 of my babies. I am Dominique Catres.
Social media platforms and the rise of technology can be extremely insensitive to victims. There's a TikTok account called My Story, which has AI representations of murdered children, in which the kids themselves speak and describe the crimes against them in extreme detail. TikTok has made no effort to ban the account or other copycat accounts like it.
On top of these creepy types of media, there's also a lack of diversity within the types of cases that are portrayed on the media. What's the last murder you've seen on the news?
Gabby Petito.
There was this girl, and she was in a forest.
Probably Gabby Petito.
With this other young kid. Yeah, this other young kid.
Saved.
Gabby Petito was a YouTuber/influencer who went on a 4-month road trip with her boyfriend, Brian Laundrie. Gabby goes missing on this trip, seen having fights with her boyfriend a couple of days before communication is cut off between Gabby and her mom. The boyfriend goes into hiding, and there is a massive manhunt performed to find her. Once her body is found, the autopsies reveal that she was strangled to death, and that the most likely suspect is Brian. There is a wave of media following her story. This story was a tragedy, but it is clear that because Gabby Petito was white, her story was followed more closely than stories surrounding people of color. The media should have been following the story, but the same attention should be going to stories about people of color as well. The media attention of this case allowed for it to be picked up by the FBI, who took control, detaining and questioning Brian, who admitted to the crime later in his suicide note, where he is found dead. He shot himself in the head.
But is this just a one-time event, or is this a pattern?
I had a nephew in Texas who was gay, and he died under suspicious circumstances. And when it happened, I called the local Texas police department. This was a very small, rural place in Texas, and I identified myself as an attorney. I gave them my North Carolina State Bar number, mechanism to check, told them I was interested in this homicide, and I was simply told that they didn't care, that because the individual was a drug user, and he had died of a drug overdose, which might have been assisted, aided, or even completed by another individual. Because he was both gay and a drug user, they didn't care, and they were simply going to leave it as listed as an accidental death. Now, they used language that was much rougher that I wouldn't use, but basically they didn't care about him.
The clearance rate going down has affected minorities the most. According to the ACLU, the clearance rate for white victims is 87%. But for black victims, only 59%.
These examples go on to affect multiple different socioeconomic and racial groups, leading to distrust within the community and police.
You hear and people talk about it in the political aspect. And in some areas, people have grown to distrust the police and stuff like that. So, when I worked in Brooklyn and New York back in the 80s, there was a big distrust with the police back then. There were a lot of things going on politically and stuff way back then. So there was some distrust. Yeah, I've seen it. So if you don't trust the police when you're talking to them, how are you getting the accurate information? So we have to make sure, we're getting better information or trying to get them, like anything else. If you don't trust somebody you're going to talk to, are you going to tell them everything? You're going to be kind of closed-minded or closed up and not be so forthcoming and afraid that, if the police ain't going to do the right thing, is going to affect the way they do things or the way they talk or open up to us.
So what can we do at this point to help murder investigations become more effective?
So one of the reforms I talked about was, I think you should take the power away from the prosecutor to determine the charge. I think you need a neutral judicial figure, kind of like a judge, but not handling the actual guilty.
a more fair identification process would have several different suspects. Like you wouldn't just, for example, show the person that you just arrested to the eyewitness and say, oh, is it this guy? Because they're more likely to say, yeah, because it's like, well, the police are showing me this person. They must know something I don't know.
One of the things we got to work on when people distrust us, we just got to be a little more patient and try to convince them that, hey, we're just looking for the right reason here, what happened, and to stop the crime or whatever crime is committed, apprehend the people that would commit it.
The problems are evident, but so what? We need change. Murder deserves justice, and murder investigations are currently incapable of fulfilling that promise. But it's not impossible. There's hope for the future. We've seen massive growth in technology, and as the world continues to progress, hopefully murder investigations will with it. We need justice for those who have been failed by the system that's supposed to save them. And the best way to do so is to move forward and change the systemic flaws that have ruled murder investigations for far too long.